It would be in 801 M30 when the Emperor would find the first of his sons, Horus Lupercal, as long as you are not taking into account the records, which may have been falsified, of Alfarius' own discovery. Unlike the majority of his scattered sons, whose gestation pods were hurled far across the galaxy by the unknown will of the warp, Horus had landed far closer to Terra. His arrival on Cthonia, a world so near to the cradle of mankind, raises questions that remain unanswered even to this day. Was this proximity mere chance, or was Horus meant to be found first? Official records state that Horus was discovered in his youth, and that he would be the first Primarch to be rediscovered by the Emperor, and more importantly, the first to be raised at his side. But there are conflicting accounts that muddy the clarity of this narrative. Some imperial sources depict Horus as a child warrior, surviving amidst the Chthonian gangs and shaped by its pitiless underworld. Others insist he was swiftly brought back to Terra, where he grew up under the direct tutelage of the Emperor, witnessing firsthand the formation of the Imperium through political warfare and martial conquest. What is consistent, however, is that these fractious accounts state that Horus took command of his legion extremely early on during the Great Crusade. Unlike his brothers, who would be reunited with their legions decades, even hundreds of years into the campaign, Horus began his rise from within the vanguard of humanity, as he was seen not merely as a warrior to be shaped into a proper implement of combat, but he was the prototype for how all Primarchs would be treated by the Emperor. Whether he was molded in the killing pits of Cthonia, or from within the shadow of the Emperor's own glory, Horus emerged as the ideal commander for a legion bred for rapid and overwhelming force. The Luna Wolves, already a seasoned and well-tested battle force, which had been bolstered by the integration of feral recruits, now had its leader whose ambition was only equaled by his charisma. Cthonia gave the 16th Legion its flesh, and the Emperor gave it its purpose, but it would be Horus who would give them momentum. As with so many of the elements of his Primarch project, clarity vanishes in the margins, as it seems that the exact clarity of accounts confirming when, in fact, Horus was recovered, or even if he was the first of his lost gene sons, or if the accounts are actually reversed and Horus was not found until after Alfarius, is widely disputed. But what remains accepted amongst Imperial scholars is that this truth will remain disputed despite how quickly Horus was given command of the Luna Wolves. However, what is clearly understood is even when he was first given command, Horus, being under the Emperor's direct tutelage and his only son, placed him in a position of exceptional influence, not merely as a creation of the Master of Mankind, but as his sole confidant, companion, and heir during the formative years of the Imperium. There was, by all reliable accounts, a genuine bond between them. The Emperor was even recorded to have devoted extensive time to his protege, educating him personally and shaping him while preparing the Primarch not only for war, but for command on a scale the galaxy had not seen in over 10,000 years. And when Horus was granted command of his Luna Wolves, he took complete control of a force of 10,000 transhuman warriors crafted from his own gene template. And with the post-human legionaries at his side, Horus joined the Emperor on his earliest campaigns of the Great Crusade, which had begun formally in 789 M30, a few years before Horus had been officially rediscovered on Cthonia. However, records are inconsistent to the point that some believe that Horus being found on Cthonia was actually a cover, and that Horus actually advanced with the Emperor during his earliest campaigns prior to his supposed discovery on Cthonia. However, Horus was not the only asset taken from Cthonia. By the time the Great Crusade began, Chthonia's mineral wealth had already been completely exhausted, as the mines were utterly and totally dead. Its manufactura rusted and functionally inoperable, yet the planet remained valuable to the Imperium, not for what it produced, but for whom it bred. Cthonia had become a crucible, a veritable breeding ground for war-born humanity. Generations of savage hive gangs, techno-barbarian tribes, and degenerate reprobate militias had evolved into something the nascent Imperium needed far more than plasteel or ceramite. It needed war-hardened killers, survivors, men and youths raised without mercy, without human empathy, stripped of fear and forged by endless struggle. Its proximity to Terra allowed it to sustain limited contact, even throughout the worst of the Age of Strife, and so it was one of the first worlds marked for conscription by the early fleets of the Imperium. Imperial recruitment squads arrived with terrifying efficiency. At least one archived report describes tens of thousands of adolescent gangers being chained together in the holds of prison shuttles, shipped straight to the Selenar Vault beneath Luna's very surface, where the gene rights of Luna, ancient allies of the Emperor, converted this raw, nubile flesh into legionnaire stock. However, not all those who had been taken would become Astartes, as the majority would be pressed into the Imperial Army, including the elite detachments created by the Emperor, such as the Solar Auxilia and the feared Chthonian headhunters. But those judged most suitable, physically and psychologically, would be inducted into the 16th Legion. There, beneath the sterile lights of Luna, and within its gene laboratories, they would be reborn. This marked a significant deviation from the standard practice. Early aspirants of the Legion's Astartes had been drawn primarily from Terra and its own war-torn populations. Later, the rediscovery of the planets of the Primarchs would shift recruitment towards feral and feudal worlds, particularly emphasizing the worlds the Primarchs came from, granting them a quick connection to the Imperium proper and a quicker integration of said troops into the Imperium's massively growing armies. This has led to the theories that some of the Primarchs were not found on distant worlds, but rather that the Emperor somehow was able to recover them before they ever landed, and that Horus was only said to have been from Cthonia in order to influence the world into acquiescing to the Imperium's demands much faster, as Cthonia was a prototype if you will, where its harsh, hollow world, whose surviving youth would require little indoctrination to become killers, especially after going psychohypnotic treatment and neural conditioning, would require somewhat of a push to be as guaranteeably loyal as those from a world with a Primarch. So these, the Sons of Cthonia, would emerge not as hollow men, but as the Sons of Horus, linked not only to Terra via a compact, but through being the fertile ground upon which one of the Emperor's sons was raised, allowing them to quickly become highly disciplined space marines of exceptional loyalty. And it was said that they bore no illusions about the horrors of the galaxy. They had, after all, been born to them, and thus the Luna Wolves would be reborn, not merely in the image of their Primarch, but with the blood of this feral, savage, yet powerful world running through their veins. Following the full and proper absorption of Chthonia's gene stock into the 16th Legion, the Luna Wolves underwent a fundamental transformation, not one of numbers, but of spirit. The integration of these new initiates did more than bolster its ranks. It infused the Legion with a different rhythm, a different vocabulary of war and survival. The Terran-born Astartes who had formed the foundation of the Luna Wolves found themselves fighting shoulder to shoulder with warriors who bore an imprint of 1,000 generations of brutal gang warfare, cultural legacies etched into instinct as deeply as into memory. Despite the indoctrination protocols of the time, psychic, hypnotic, and mnemonic, the core behavioral reflexes of the Chthonian origin persisted beneath a veneer of standard legionary conditioning. It is now theorized by several Order Historicus subcells that this might have been an intentional process. The wars of the Great Crusade claimed Terran-born Luna Wolves in mounting numbers. The more methodical, disciplined traditions of old Earth began to fade, and so the voice of Terra would grow quieter and quieter still within the 16th. What replaced it did not erase the Legion's previous ethos or its culture, but rather it reshaped it, subtly at first, then unmistakably. Changes emerged across the ranks of the Legion, in both form and custom. Personal stylings, such as the use of top knots and mohawk, once reserved exclusively for the Chthonian headhunters, became widespread and almost standard within the Legion, as these were not merely aesthetic choices, but visible declarations of status, survival, and rank, woven into the very iconography of their power armor. In chilling symbolic tradition, Astartes, wounded in honorable combat, etched a deep scratch across their ceramites' eye lenses, and it would always be in the same location. This was as a tribute to a worthy foe who had harmed them. On Cthonia, this would be done right above the eye and potentially damaging the visual organ. These were not mere acts of mourning, but rather acknowledgements, as if each scratch was a bookmark in an endless death ledger. Perhaps most revealing is its integration of the Chthonian term Abithian, meaning the slitting of an enemy's throat in sanctioned combat. This word was originally a grim fixture of hive gang duels, and it came to be widely used within the Luna Wolves as a mark of final pacification of a hostile campaign. That term, born in the underworld slaughter, became synonymous with imperial victory. And this speaks volumes to the impact that integrating a world like Cthonia did into the Imperium. Leadership too was no longer judged solely by tactical acumen or honorific rank. Instead, it began to mirror the hierarchical structure of Chthonian gang culture, where charisma and reputation were tantamount to law. A commander's influence extended far beyond formal chains of command. It became a personal, even tribal affair. This trend would reach its zenith with Horus's personal cult, which was absolute, as his charisma supernaturally eclipsed even reason, and the reverence the Legion came to hold with him bordered on religious awe, as it was not merely loyalty, it was an identity, and it would one day cost them everything. Yet in terms of raw combat efficiency, the transformation did not weaken the Luna Wolves, quite the opposite. The inclusion of Chthonian warriors only sharpened the Legion's edge. Their tactical doctrine remained flexible, able to prosecute almost any war across any theater, but when possible, their preferred approach became unmistakable, iconic even, overwhelming synchronized annihilation delivered with brutal swiftness from multiple directions at once. It became standard practice. A system marked for imperial conquest would fall in what appeared to be a single blow, but in reality was a myriad of simultaneous cuts, death by 1,000 cuts in a single instance. The Luna Wolves' voidcraft, shaped in sphere formations, would accelerate inwards from the periphery of the star system, breaking into countless shards as it neared planetary targets. Each subfleet acted like an individual blade that would be driven deep as they simultaneously initiated orbital saturation bombardment. Within moments of this occurring, mass drop pods would descend upon coordinated waves, striking enemy strongholds, void stations, and population centers simultaneously. Resistance, when it dare surface, was quickly identified and overwhelmed, encircled, and destroyed, not through attritional warfare, but through precision implementations of savagery, executed at such high velocity and coordination that it more resembled a predator's ambush than a military campaign. In the wake of these assaults, Imperial Army regiments would arrive and cleanse the debris, as would administrative governing edifices be built and log the world as compliant. For many of these forces, there was little to do but bury the dead and record the silence left behind. This was the new face of the 16th Legion, an apex war machine whose soul no longer was that purely of Terran origin, but of Chthonian as well, forged in fire and tempered by blood, all the while being led by the first found son of the Emperor, a man who would become first amongst equals and then one of the 9 devils. Throughout the breadth and height of the Great Crusade, the 16th Legion, known in those years as the Luna Wolves, became synonymous with victory purchased in blood. Their methods of war were never subtle, never ornate, but they were always devastatingly effective. Though their tactics lacked the aesthetic formality or precision favored by other legions, their results were irrefutable. A trail of shattered regimes and silenced resistance stretched far and wide behind them, each marked not by ceremony but by conquest. From their earliest engagements to their final pre-heresy campaigns, the Luna Wolves approached warfare with a singular, unyielding principle: annihilation through decisive aggression. This philosophy, while echoing the calculated ferocity of Chthonian gang warfare, proved remarkably compatible with the Imperium's need for swift expansion and unrelenting, unending momentum. As worlds fell before them, the name of Horus, Primarch of the 16th, and the Emperor's most lauded son, grew in stature beyond that of any of his brothers. Historical data fragments from the campaign logs indicate a rather notable pattern. The Luna Wolves would arrive, isolate and destroy resistance, establish compliant points within the world, then depart, all within a time frame that would leave little room for occupation, reconnaissance, or world building. What mattered to them was conquest, and they were obsessed with accomplishing what mattered to them. The very mission would be achieved regardless of the tactical necessities. The rest could be managed by the administratum and the imperial army in the Legion's wake. This attitude was most clearly demonstrated during the early consolidation of the Sol system, itself a campaign often obscured by the grand theaters of the later Crusade. Yet even here, the Luna Wolves fought with the same ruthless resolve that they would become later known for. Their actions bore the hallmarks of their Chthonian inheritance: swift identification of leadership targets, followed by immediate, overwhelming, and precise execution. For them, taking prisoners was rare, viewed not through the lens of an ethical concern, but as a logistical liability. Unwanted mouths, as one post-campaign review phrased it, echoing old Chthonian idioms with a chilling simplicity. To the Luna Wolves, war was not a ceremony, nor a chessboard. It was a street fight at a galactic scale. Either a conflict was ended quickly through force of will and the application of overwhelming force, or it dragged on and became wasteful. Their position was always clear. The first was acceptable, the second was intolerable. Over the course of more than 2 standard centuries, the 16th Legion prosecuted this war doctrine without apology or deviation. With every war zone they pacified, their renown grew further and further still. Horus, as a commander and symbol of the Legion's supremacy, was glorified by imperial propaganda, the Council of Terra, and even his fellow Primarchs. His generalship was not merely respected, but it became legend. So complete was the Luna Wolves' dominance in campaign after campaign that other legions began to often request deployment alongside them. This development bears particular note, as though interlegionary cooperation was often marred by rivalry. The presence of the Luna Wolves was not only accepted, but welcome. Their battlefield performance and their unity, along with the certainty of their success, made them an anchor in uncertain war zones. Whether leading the initial assault into a hostile sector, or operating as elite support within the broader army cohort, the Luna Wolves delivered. Defeat, when it came, was so rare, in fact, that individual setbacks were studied with clinical intensity by strategists across the Imperium. But such reversals were the exception, not the rule. In most accounts, victory followed their deployment like a shadow. The Luna Wolves were more than soldiers. They were instruments, refined, sharpened, and unleashed. Instruments not of diplomacy or occupation, but of fire, steel, and the relentless will of mankind to reclaim its right to inherit the stars. In the closing years before the dawn of the 31st millennium, their legacy was secure, their strength unchallenged, their faith in Horus absolute, and unfortunately that would prove the most dangerous victory of all. The hunting of the Akereth is a little known and rarely spoken about event, hidden within the halls of the Ordo Xenos. The Akereth, known in frontier vernacular as the Bone Drinkers, represented a singular threat, not through sheer force, but through applying a method of predation. These parasitic fungoid organisms existed not as individuals, but as interconnected biological clusters, through which contagion and will were both shared in equal measure. The true horror lay in their sustenance, the slow extraction of bone marrow from sentient living hosts. Death for their victims was neither swift nor clean. The Akereth were first encountered during the initial Crusade push into the western fringes of Segmentum Solar. Bereft of their own technology, they had survived by infesting void ships scavenged from other species and preying upon isolated colonies, especially those on feral-classed worlds, too primitive to mount a coordinated defense. Their intelligence, if it could be called such, was adaptive but craven. They would strike from the dark and retreat the moment resistance presented itself. In the early years of the Crusade, extermination orders were jointly executed by the Luna Wolves and the 8th Legion, not yet bearing the moniker Night Lords. These early campaigns were believed to have driven the Xenos into extinction. However, fragmentary sightings and void distress signals would later suggest a chilling truth. The Anchoreth had not been destroyed, only greatly dispersed. By 986 M30, survivors of remote outposts and merchant crews began reporting a series of attacks, isolated incidents at first, but bearing oh so familiar signals. Skeletal remains drained absolutely of bone marrow, and void ships left hollow. Like chitinous husks, the Imperial Command recognized the resurgence of the species, and so they would act decisively. The Alpha Legion, newly reunited with the Primarch Alfarius, and untested in campaigns of extermination, was thereby dispatched under sealed orders. The campaign lasted only 3 standard years, operating deep within stellar waste near Olmec. Deception, infiltration, and misdirection, methods native to the Alpha Legion, were weaponized to isolate, purge, and eliminate the remaining Anchoreth blooms. No central hive was ever found, no singular greater intelligence uncovered. Yet by the end of the campaign, no further sightings of these beings would ever be recorded. Whether the bone drinkers were truly eradicated or merely driven deeper still into the shadows of the void remains unconfirmed. Next would be the fall of Rilius, occurring at an unknown date in M30. As some of the episodes within the early life of Horus Lupercal seem to defy the formality of standard military records. Instead, they are preserved in the oral traditions of Space Marine chapters, retold as lessons of loyalty, ferocity, and sacrifice. One such incident unfolded on Rilius, a fortified human city that refused to yield to the Imperial truth and denied the unity with Holy Terra. Over 30 years after his rediscovery, Horus would often fight with the Emperor, and Rilius would become one of the foundation stones for this bond. During the siege, Imperial forces faced protracted resistance, yet the true danger would come not from frontal assault, but from subterfuge. Beneath the city's surface lay a network of tunnels unknown to Imperial strategists, and through them, hundreds of shock troops launched a coordinated ambush against the Imperial Command encampment. In the sudden attack, the command staff, including the Emperor and Horus, were caught completely unprepared and unarmored. What followed was a brutal close-quarters melee, the kind where strength, instinct, and unshakable will decide who survives. With only their weapons and each other, the Emperor and his son fought back to back, cutting down wave upon wave of assailants, the bodies stacking higher and higher until they were veritable mountains. It was during this melee that a plasma discharge struck Horus squarely in center mass, knocking the young Primarch to the ground. For a moment, history teetered on a knife's edge. The Emperor, unflinching, took position over his fallen son and refused to yield. With blade and wrath, he held the line until reinforcements arrived and the attackers were routed. The siege would continue and the city would eventually fall. But for that singular moment, etched only in living memory, one truth was immutable. The bond between father and son was not merely political, but strategic. It was parental, and it was absolute, at least for a time. Up next for the Luna Wolves would be the Goro Hollowing, occurring once again at an unknown date in the 30th millennium. Deep within the Telon Reach resided one of the Orc empires who were not dissimilar in scale and ferocity to that of Ulnor. Its very epicenter was Goro, a world formed not of rock, but of scrap and refuse, twisted into an iron shell by the toil and violence of its rulers, the mech boys of Goro, mad scientists in the crude idiom of their kind. And they had constructed a war machine culture unlike any which had been previously encountered. Their obsession with plasma, a volatile form of energy, was unlike anything recorded prior. This technology would be deployed in a way that was both reckless and brilliant, allowing them to have repeatedly stall Imperial advances, incinerating fleets and decimating spearheads with the greatest of ease. The Emperor of Mankind quickly declared that Goro must not be merely taken, but obliterated, annihilated, and completely erased from the face of existence. When the assault began, it was a declaration in scale as much of intent. Over 1,000 warships simultaneously emerged from the warp, and it was the Emperor himself who issued the order to strike. Horus Lupercal resplendent and unflinching, stood at his side as a tide of assault craft descended, while the Luna Wolves executed teleportation strikes directly into the planet's substructure, as Goro's scrap mantle was all but impervious to orbital bombardments regardless of how sustained they were, forcing Astartes into the hollow planet, having to go through it layer by layer. In the vanguard of this descent were Horus, the Emperor, and a cadre of black-armored Justarian Terminators of the Luna Wolves' First Company, accompanied by wardens of the Legionis Custodes. What awaited them below was no mere Xenos resistance, but a storm of iron, muscle, and fire. Orcs of Goro were colossal, bigger even than the orcs of any other empire. In part, this was because they had been crudely enhanced with cybernetics, down to a man, scavenged and structured into the very growth of their already monstrous frames. Some were so large they towered even over revered Contemptor dreadnoughts of the Legion's Astartes. Their weapons burned through ceramite plate and ripped the warriors inside with equal measure of heat and force. The battle itself reached its fulcrum when the Emperor was cut off from his guard amidst this brouhaha. He himself would carve a path through the enemy, slaying hundreds upon hundreds, but Goro's plasma weapons were no mere ornament, and a blast would strike him, weakening his defenses. In that very moment, one orc of immense size, a war leader, almost incomparable to any other, surged forward, gripping the Emperor in both his augmented fists with such force that it buckled the warplate of humanity's leader and began to crush the life from him. Then Horus came. He burst into the fray, his blade flashing once, twice. In said process, he sheared the arms from the orc beast before he could finish. With the momentum of this act, the reunited father and son drove the force deeper and deeper still into the metal world. There, at the planet's core, the Emperor enacted his true design. Goro's power was delivered from a plasma sphere encased in a warp-fold envelope, creating a self-sustaining, perpetual engine of destruction. To resolve the issue of the world, he decided just to collapse it. The implosion itself shattered the planet's structural integrity, causing a cascading effect that forced Goro to fold inward upon itself. What remained was a hollowed shell of oxidized debris drifting in the vacuum, an eternal tombstone of an empire extinguished in a single momentous swooping blow. And so that was how Horus would repay his debt on Relis, not merely by blade, but by his resolve, and by fixing the mistake the Custodes had made, allowing their sire to almost die yet again, which seems like an inherent flaw of the Custodes, constantly having others clean up their messes, fix the failures they have caused, their single duty protecting their sire, almost always being something that they fail at to some degree. When Imperial forces first advanced into the turbulent systems of the Ordoni cluster, they found that it was under the rule of Tentrius, a warlord of exceptional cunning and restraint. Unlike many other petty kings or void lords before him, Tentrius saw the inevitability of his situation. Facing the inexorable advance of the Great Crusade, he chose survival by bending the knee, which led the Imperium to not destroying him. Instead, they elevated him. The Emperor, ever the pragmatist, would see a place for men like Tentrius, leaders with ambition, drive, and ruthlessness, but who knew their place. Granted a modest fleet and a small contingent of Imperial army regiments, Tentrius became a tool for the Great Crusade's expansion, and wielding him, the Imperium enabled his legend to be built. Over 5 decades, he carved a swath of compliance all around and about the Halo stars, conquering worlds not merely for Terra, but for his own legacy. His campaigns grew in scope and savagery as time went on. Imperial tacticians whispered of his victories. Reports note his audiences with Malcador the Sigillite, and even the recognition of several Primarchs. By all extents and measures, he was a man trusted, perhaps even admired by all those within the Imperium. But Tentrius would not remain loyal. At the height of his power, he ineptly chose to betray the Imperium. One by one, he turned compliant worlds into his personal vassals. Systems once brought into imperial compliance were absorbed into his self-styled dominion. No longer an agent of unity, Tentrius raised the banner of his own cause. His fleet multiplied, vastly swelling as his armies grew out of control. Tens of millions followed him, as 100 human-settled worlds acknowledged only his rule, ringed by fortified bastions and garrison worlds, in essence built to the standards of the Imperial Fist. Tentress Rebel Empire carved out its own realm amongst the stars. The Imperium, now forced to reckon with such a defector, responded with finality, and they sent Horus to deliver this end. In this conflict, the War Master did not act alone. While the Luna Wolves formed the vanguard, Horus dispatched personal requests to his brother Primarch, and he received reinforcements, arriving in strength nigh incomparable to any other that Tentress had faced, as the Shadowed Night Lords arrived, followed by the unyielding Iron Hands, and the always watching, yet silent and elusive Alpha Legion also joined in the fray, as they together formed an overwhelming force designed not merely for victory, but to completely decimate all in its path, fully breaking the backs of all those who had even considered to rebel. Reports from Imperial Recon Drone showed that the effects were immediate. Astropathic intercepts showed rebel fleets fracturing under the sheer weight of the engagement to come. Rumors, unconfirmed but widely believed, spoke of entire worlds culled within a single night, as fear did the work of fire. When Tentress finally realized that his cause was lost, the Luna Wolves struck directly. They emerged from the warp within immediate weapons range, cutting down half of Tentress's command fleet before countermeasures could be issued. The strike was surgical, precise, and absolute. Then, within the breach made, Horus personally led 50 Justarian Terminators of his first company in a teleportation assault upon the flagship's bridge. Here, the slaughter was total and absolute. Not a single soul was left. But the campaign would not end with Tentress's death. It merely intensified. Horus, it is said, took the betrayal personally. Tentress had been given trust, recognition, and command, only to turn. That insult demanded not only retribution, but a great scouring. The Night Lords were ordered to decimate every world of the rebel dominion. The Iron Hands, with elements of the Ordo Redactor, unleashed industrial annihilation. Fortress cities were razed, planetary crusts fractured, atmospheric toxins were deployed in saturation volley. No stronghold would remain intact, no rebel remained whole. Once this castigation was complete, Horus dispatched a final message to Terra. A gold-dipped soul, once belonging to Tentress, arrived under heavy guard. The custodian who bore it spoke only one sentence: so perish all traitors. Before the tempest of the heresy, before the names of worlds like Isfan and Calf became bywords of ruin, there were signs, patterns even, preserved within deeper stratas of imperial history. 3 such events were separated by time but linked by consequences, and they stand as subtle preambles to the tragedy of the War Master. One of these events would be the compliance of Moloch, the night world of Moloch, a jewel of martial lineage and buried secrets. Its compliance was unlike any other, and it occurred in 869 M30. This uniqueness was not merely for the scale of the force deployed, but for the presence of the Emperor himself, a rare occurrence noted with reverence and unease in Mechanicum record. The Luna Wolves fought alongside the Dark Angels, the Emperor's children, and the White Scars. Titan legions also marched in tandem with the Mechanicum and the thousands upon thousands of Imperialis Auxilia regiments that were deployed. Victory was swift, celebratory, and superficially standard. Cypherian Divine of House Divine was appointed as the planetary governor, but what followed was not a celebration in the standard means. In the presence of his sons, several of the Primarchs included, the Emperor led them beneath the surface of Moloch. There he revealed a warp portal, an ancient and hidden variation of these incredibly rare sites. Without counsel or warning, he stepped through into the realm of chaos. When he returned, he appeared changed, older, far more powerful, and functionally distant. Then the mystery would compound as he erased his son's memories of what had transpired upon Moloch. Orders were issued, and a massive garrison force, nearly 100 auxilia regiments, 3 titanic cohorts, and elements of 2 legions whose lineage is unknown to us, were stationed to guard the portal perpetually. The reason for this secrecy remains unspoken, the purpose of which, and if there was any true parley which occurred upon the warp, and the reason behind the memory wipes remain unknown. But what we do know is the strangeness of the disproportionate security, which point to a singular conclusion. Something on Moloch truly and deeply terrified the Emperor beyond all else, as the force left behind was greater than any singular legion. A century later, in 921 M30, the Luna Wolves encountered the Chelid, an alien species native to the planet Chelid. These were reptilian, martial, and repulsive in both physiology and temperament. From the first moment of contact with the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, hostilities erupted. There was no diplomacy, only war, and it became a campaign marked by attrition and suffering. The Khalid, though primitive by Imperial standards, were a force to be reckoned with, in particular within the resistance. Their offense, on the other hand, proved significantly less viable. Their skill in combat proved more than a match for the standard forces and tactic employed by the Luna Wolves, forcing them into a brutal and prolonged engagement. During this campaign, Horus had not yet claimed the title of War Master. Amongst his sons, he was simply called the Commander, a leader forging his legend in the fires of hardship and adversity. The records of this campaign are sparse in strategic value, but rich in tone, wariness, frustration, and blood. The genocide of the species was complete, but it left a mark upon those who survived the campaign, one of which the Legion's documents speak purely of misery. Was it merely fatigue, or that something began to unwind within the soul of the 16th Legion? 60 years before the fall of Horus, the world of Davin entered Imperial records in 941 M30, and it entered the records as 63-8, a feral world whose resistance to compliance was brief. The warrior tribes, though savage, demonstrated a quality that Horus found compelling. This quality was a combination of courage, adaptability, and above all else, total, nigh dogmatic loyalty. Horus allowed the Davinites to retain much of their culture, yet he did more than conquer. He embraced them. In return, they gave him something that would outlast battle, the concept of a warrior lodge. And it spread rapidly amongst the Luna Wolves, taking root as an unofficial brotherhood. But this cultural exchange bore seeds of future disaster. To oversee the world's integration, Horus left behind a detachment of the 17th Legion, known as the Imperial Herald, under the command of Captain Cor Ferron. Alongside them, Governor Eugene Temba, a close, longtime companion of Horus, would be assigned as the planetary command. What followed, however, was not stability, but slow and unceasing corruption. The people of Davin's moon rejected imperial authority, but over time, refusal would grow malignant. Sorcerers' forces, later confirmed to be aligned with the plague god Nurgle, would be unleashed, and Temba, alongside his garrison, would succumb, leading them to be twisted and reborn in a blasphemous form. Unbeknownst to the Imperium, the entire population of Davin had long served the ruinous powers. Their compliance and allegiance was a facade, their surrender a trap laid deep in time. The infection of Temba was one of the main goals, as it would lie dormant for decades until the Luna Wolves had returned to investigate, and that return would change everything. The rediscovery of Davin's true nature would shatter the minds of the one once called the Commander, and give rise to the War Master. As we continue our dissection of the events preceding the heresy, we encounter a cluster of compliance campaigns whose details were often overlooked or redacted in a manner that provides crucial insight to the temperament and the long-term intentions of the 16th Legion. These are not campaigns defined by grand declarations or celebrated triumphs, but by silence and absence, leaving a faint trail of decisions that would echo in the galactic cataclysm to come. What little survives regarding the compliance of Daromir exists only as fragmentary logs from joint operational files of the Luna Wolves and Night Lord's legions. The planet's name surfaces briefly in overlapping command rosters and transit orders, suggesting a swift and likely brutal campaign conducted with clinical aggression characteristic of both legions. No data survives concerning the cultural resistance of Daromir's inhabitants. Notably, no records exist of a prolonged siege, negotiations, or restructuring, only a designation of compliant. This suggests either a total annihilation of the defending force or a deliberate suppression of post-engagement analysis. Given the presence of the Night Lords, one might speculate that fear was a primary weapon deployed. But if that was the case, then what was the purpose of the Luna Wolves' involvement? The compliance of Tenthos would be next. Tenthos was more documented, but no less peculiar. Here the Luna Wolves were pitted against a Xeno species whose identity has been excised, or it was intentionally never recorded at all. The war, however, was far from bloodless. The campaign was marked by a protracted siege against multiple fortified Xenos-controlled cities spanning Thanatos' continent. Resistance was supposedly deeply entrenched, and progress was unbelievably costly. In response, Horus turned to the forge world of Daimat with an extraordinary commission: the design of a siege weapon vast enough to obliterate enemy fortresses at a continental scale. The magnitude of this order speaks volumes about the expected scale of the devastation, but the machines, whose schematics were classified as Ordinatus grade, were not completed on schedule. By the time Daimat's tech priests delivered the engines, the campaign had been ended. Over 18 standard months prior, the Xenos were gone and Horus moved on, the siege engines mysteriously taken in tow. Rather than redeploy the engines, they would be now stored on Daimat, where they would remain until Horus revealed his treachery on Isstvan III. His traitor forces would return to the world of Daimat, not in loyalty but in conquest, reclaiming the weaponry which had been originally forged under Imperial command, almost as if that was the intent of sanctioning the entire campaign. Of the three actions, the events on Diantha are the most disturbing. The Luna Wolves encountered a unique threat: the Overseers, self-aware machines commanded by a central artificial intelligence, only known as the Archdroid. Such an entity was not just a violation of the Imperial truth, it was an echo of the greatest terror of the Dark Age of technology. The Emperor's edict was clear and absolute. Under no circumstances should any machine spirit of this type be allowed to exist. On Diantha, that order was executed to the letter. The battle was vicious. The Overseers resisted, not only with computational precision, but with an eerie tenacity bordering on grief. Despite suffering severe losses, the Luna Wolves eradicated every last machine, every last construct, core, and node. Only afterward did they uncover the origin of the threat. The Overseers had not rebelled, but waited. They had been designed by an offshoot of humanity, settlers back during the Dark Age, who had long since perished for untold centuries. These machines had maintained the planet's decaying infrastructure, preserving a legacy of their creators. There had not been any uprising, only programming fulfilled beyond the end of their master's life. And yet, under the Emperor's law, they had to die. In this next segment of our chronological inquiry, we examine a quartet of campaigns which at first glance appear to mark a high tide of imperial expansion. Yet beneath these triumphs and proclamations lies a fractured alliance and swelling rivalries, along with the signs of pride's first stirrings. Through the blood-slicked tundras and siege-choked cities, the Luna Wolves once again stood amongst their brothers. But what followed would shape more than just history. It would reshape how war were declared. The Gyros Thrivian campaigns stand alone, not just for their scale, but for their near collapse of Imperial forces, despite their formidable strength. The Luna Wolves, the Imperial Fists, and the Death Guard, known to be three of the most relentless and unyielding Space Marine legions, were deployed against the Orc warlord Garkul Blackfang, whose rising wog had consumed entire subsectors. By the time they reached its crescendo, Garkul's horde numbered in the millions upon millions, perhaps even billions, anchored by titanic gargants and driven upon by orcs of unmatched and strange brilliance. Despite the legionaries' might being deployed against them, the Imperium had its forces near ruin. Only then did the Emperor directly intervene, an event that was so rare in recent times it was etched into imperial memory. Arriving upon his flagship, Bisiphus, the master of mankind descended alongside with his personal cohort of Legio Custodes. The custodians, clad in their armite, bearing the sigils of his will, tore through the orc masses with clinical precision. The Emperor himself confronted Gargoyle Blackfang upon the top of a massive gargant. The Xenos warlord then fell by the Emperor's own hand. The slaughter that followed was unprecedented. Over 100,000 orcs were slain. The Legio Custodes suffered only 3 casualties, which, looking back upon imperial records, seems to be less common than one would normally be led to believe. So profound was the Emperor's respect for the sacrifice of said casualties that he inscribed the names of the 3 fallen Custodes into his armor, an act without known precedent. No other campaign during the Great Crusade saw such a direct intervention, and the implications are still debated to this day, yet this was a humiliation for the future War Master. Up next would be the pacification of Skyrian. Skyrian skies burned with atmospheric bombardments as 4 legions, the Luna Wolves, the Iron Warriors, the Emperor's Children, and the Imperial Fist, descended upon the Xenos Badon. While the Luna Wolves conducted shock assaults and the Emperor's Children advanced with a methodical grace, the Iron Warriors would be the ones who truly turned the tide. During the final phases of this campaign, it was Perturabo and his legion that cracked the last bastion of Badon. Their siegecraft breached the enemy's citadel, allowing the remaining legions to pour forth and in through the opening in order to finish the fight as quickly as possible. During the ensuing victory feast, Horus publicly proclaimed Perturabo, the greatest siege master of the Great Crusade, a rare moment of acknowledgement from the War Master. However, this praise perhaps unintentionally ignited a fuse that would never be extinguished. Fulgrim, with a lilt of jest but the edge of calculation, turned to Rogel Dorn and asked whether Perturabo could breach even the defenses he had created upon Terra. Dorn's response was measured, but rather defensive. If well planned, I regard them as proof against any assault. What followed was a silence and then fury, as Perturabo erupted, hurling accusations and contempt at Dorn. What might have been brushed aside in calmer times had instead calcified into a long-lasting, nigh eternal resentment. From that moment on, the Iron Warriors and the Imperial Fist never again would fight side by side for the remainder of the Great Crusade. One cannot help but note, was this rift born in battle, in victory, or by the machinations of those who were unintentionally already being taken down the path of chaos? Up next would be the compliance of Crypt. The world of Crypt was a frozen wasteland, its oceans turned jagged glaciers, and its skies a constant swell of blue storms. Here the Luna Wolves and the Death Guard executed a swift compliance campaign against orc forces entrenched across the tundra. For more than a week, the legionaries fought side by side, staining white ice black with the blood of greenskins. Luna Wolves captain Gabriel Loken of the 10th Company fought in tandem with the Death Guard battle captain Nathaniel Garrow and his 7th Company, forming a bond that would last for the rest of their lives. Though the campaign was short, the bonds forged in frost and fire would forever reverberate as Logan and Garrow, 2 commanders whose paths would later intersect under grimmer circumstances, had first stood together and gained each other's implicit trust on the frozen plains of Crypt. During 970 M30, Zanmund's compliance was executed by the Luna Wolves, a Death Guard force led by First Captain Callus Typhon, along with a detachment of the Dark Angels under Luther, Regent of Caliban. Both would join the Wolves. The campaign was a quick success, as the Xenos presence was quickly eradicated and their victors gathered for celebration under arms and unity. But the moment was short-lived, as the arrival of Lionel Johnson shattered the illusion. The Primarch of the Dark Angels arrived in a fury, rebuking Luther in front of the assembled commanders for disobeying orders to remain on Caliban. No formal reprimand would be issued, but the damage was done. The scolding struck deep, and Luther's resentment, while quiet and slowly growing, found fresh nourishment. Some say the lion's tone was harsh. Others claim Luther's actions were a subtle defiance in the making. Either way, the fracture had begun, all in part because the wolves had requested the aid. As we move deeper still into the final decades preceding the cataclysm of the Horus heresy, certain events would remain mostly cloaked, not due to the absence of data, but due to the abundance of conflicting versions. Testimonies from those who survived are still considered inconsistent, and while they would be archived in reports, they would be redacted, altered, or outright expunged. One such event centers around the last Primarch to be discovered, a reunion which was so steeped in contradiction that its very authenticity is not questioned. Of all 20 Primarchs scattered amongst the stars, it is Alpharius, Lord of the Alpha Legion, whose discovery remains the most suspect. According to the most commonly cited account, the Luna Wolves, under the direct command of the War Master, responded to a distress signal around late 970s of M30 from one of their own battleships. Upon approach, they found the vessel adrift, seemingly abandoned, as this appeared not to be a rescue, but rather a trap. Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, came under a sudden assault by an unknown hostile force. Amidst the chaos, a lone assassin infiltrated the ship's interior defenses, and then penetrated as far as the command chamber. By all records, no figure had ever come so close to slaying the War Master aboard his own vessel. What happened defies normal military explanation. Rather than executing this intruder, Horus stayed his hand, claiming that in that moment of confrontation, he had recognized the attacker as his long-lost brother, Alpharius, though no formal generic verification was recorded, and even the event itself preserved only in a handful of contradictory logs, many of which were later sequestered under the highest levels of the Inquisitorial seal. It is important to note that no other Primarch had ever been discovered in this fashion. Furthermore, the timing of Alpharius' official appearance, less than a decade before the outbreak of the Horus heresy, has led to persistent and widespread speculation within the Ordo Chronos. This along some records implying that Alpharius was indeed found before any of the other Primarchs, supposedly having landed just outside of Malcador's own personal chambers, seems to potentially contradict this retelling of history. Several theories posit that this incident may have been a deliberate deception orchestrated by the Alpha Legion itself, or forces yet unnamed. To this day, the veracity of the events remains disputed, even amongst direct records of surviving Luna Wolves. What is certain is from that moment on, the Alpha Legion entered the galactic warfare not as allies, but as players with their own script. Approximately in 998 M30, just 7 years before the fires of Isfan III would ignite, the Luna Wolves joined forces with a detachment of the White Scars in the Tried system. Though overshadowed by larger campaigns, this action was no minor operation. The Tried system was strategically located along key warp corridors, with the ruling technocratic clans maintaining advanced void warfare capabilities and incredibly powerful orbital fortresses, leading resistance to be met with due force. The Luna Wolves executed precision shock assaults, while the White Scars, true to their nature, executed rapid flanking strikes, severing the enemy's ability to coordinate or retreat. Within weeks, the system's primary power centers had been neutralized, and compliance was declared. What remains noteworthy is not the battle itself, but rather the timing. The joint operation between two powerful legions, occurring a mere 7 years before Horus's turn against the Imperium, in a manner similar to other incidents with certain legions or factions within legions that were seemingly meant to assuage the loyalty of those factions who were joined by the Luna Wolves, seems highly suspect. However, as the White Scars would never turn, it seems that the potential for this being just a mere coincidence is higher than not. In the final days of M30, with the Horus heresy drawing ever nearer, the Imperium was faced not only with division within, but an extraordinary enemy of profound spiritual perversion. This would occur in the compliance of Melkor, logged as occurring circa 999 M30. This was not simply a standard military operation. It was a calculated extermination, a last reckoning of a species that had stalked the Imperium's frontiers like phantoms, preying not merely upon flesh, but upon belief itself. The 16th Legion, known as the Luna Wolves, and the 9th Legion, known as the Blood Angels, were deployed in concert for the execution of the compliance of Melkor, a world described in classified materials as the final sanctuary of an alien species known only by the human-appropriated name of the Nephilim. The Nephilim were immense, vaguely humanoid entities whose presence defied easy classification. Smooth as soapstone, their limbs and torsos bore abstract contours that only approximated the anatomy of mankind. Their heads, domed without necks, rose directly from their shoulders and were encircled with arrays of ocular nodules and olfactory slits. In the light of Melkor's triad suns, they gleamed with an eerie translucency, giving them the appearance of sculpted glass as they moved with aquatic grace, slow and drifting at a glance, but capable of sudden and lethal speed. And their beauty masked their horror. The Nephilim were not simply conquerors. They were defilers of meaning. Their passage through the stars left devastation in its wake, a trail of 100 lost and dead worlds, each emptied completely and scoured of life. Locations such as Sagan, Del Cora Spine, Orphos Menoris, and Beta Regal, too, were reduced to mere tombs, their populations herded into towering empath chapels, and slowly devoured ritually, psychically, physically, and with purpose. To what end? Adulation. The Nephilim fed not on matter, but on belief. Their doctrine was blasphemous salvation, promises of transcendence, elevation beyond the flesh. They whispered of eternal life for the devout and unspeakable sorrow for the doubtful. They selected vulnerable, isolated, and the mournful, offering communion. Their thralls bore living masks of Nephilim flesh, implants meant to bind them deeper still into subservience. This was not indoctrination, but rather consumption. The Blood Angels and their Luna Wolves scout reconnaissance confirmed the true nature of these chapels. They were, in essence, mausoleums of withered corpses, bodies desiccated within hours, aged decades upon decades, by siphoning their very essence. The Nephilim did not merely destroy, they harvested the very soul, and the soul of humanity's dream. In the stratagem of the Vengeful Spirit, Horus Lupercal laid out his battle plans to Sanguinius, Lord of the Blood Angels and Master of Wretches. The War Master's strategy was as blunt as it was grand, a twin-pronged assault to overwhelm the Nephilim through awe and force. Horus envisioned the legions advancing side by side in full strength, an unstoppable tide of post-human might, crashing down upon the Xeno stronghold. Like the oceans these vile things sprang from, Horus declared, "We will roll over these aliens, drag them down, and drown them." Sanguinius, ever the tactician and artist of equal measure, was hesitant. The plan was brutal, direct, but it seemed better suited for brothers like Russ or Angron. Horus was persuasive, but Sanguinius consented only when he recognized the necessity of the shock and momentum in this particular engagement. However, he suggested something slightly different. The battle occurred on Malchior's radiant crystalline flat, known in naval charts as the Silver Desert. There the Nephilim emerged in full force, meeting the Luna Wolves across open terrain. Before hostilities commenced, Horus offered a parley, issuing his final demand for a complete and total surrender. The reply from the alien commanders was characteristically confident. Humanity could not win, to which Horus responded, it was the Nephilim who would fall. And the Nephilim questioned, with what army? Horus displayed his own forces, and the Nephilim, underwhelmed by the size of the forces displayed, looked upon him with confusion, to which he would reply, "We are the anvil, and they," pointing upward, "they are the hammer." With that, the sky screamed open as hundreds of ceramite drop pods streaked from orbit in a burning descent, hammering into the desert with a fury that turned reflective sand into glorified glass. Legions of stormbirds and thunderhawks, engines wailing, burst from the clouds, twisting through the sky, each one brimming with warriors of the 9th Legion. The Blood Angels fell like angels of the Old Testament, beings of vengeance, bypassing the aliens' core and striking their weakened flank. The Nephilim had committed their mass forces to the Luna Wolves and stretched their line. Their reserves had been thinned greatly, And once this trap was sprung, it was too late to retreat. Swift and unrelenting, the Blood Angels soared through the skies, tearing through the enemy's defenses. Caught between two hammering forces of Astartes, the Nephilim formations disintegrated quickly. Even their thralls, those wretched human puppets, could not halt the advance. This alien war machine, once terrible in its theological precision, was shattered completely by a combination most dangerous amidst the Legion. And on the sands of Melchior, the last of the Nephilim would be put to the sword. The compliance of Melchior was more than the liberation of a world. It was the extinction of a spiritual predator. In their destruction, the Nephilim served as a grim reminder to all those within the galaxy that the Imperium and humanity was built to resist not merely external threats, but internal collapse of reason, identity, and of truth. This was not merely a species to be sent to extinction. They were a mirror, and what stared back was something no rational soul could ever afford to worship.